What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against the beautiful Alexandra Botez, and the rules here are simple. Magnus has 30 seconds on the clock versus the 5 minutes of Alexandra, and this game did take place in a private one-on-one blitz match in the year 2023. And here we go. In the game, Alexandra opens 1d4, and Magnus does go 1g6, the modern defense. Now we have c4, bishop g7, and Alexandra playing a very interesting move here, 3f3. In the spirit of the Saemisch variation of the King's Indian defense. Her idea is simple. She wants to go e4, getting that big, beautiful pawn center in the middle of the board. All right, Magnus, d6 on the board. Typical move. Now we have e4 and knight to f6. Magnus does transpose back to a King's Indian defense here. Now we have knight to c3, short castles on the board, and bishop e3. So far, very standard stuff by Alexandra. And now here in this position, black has castles, and how does he want to proceed? Well, Magnus has a wide variety of options. For example, e5, c5, a6, c6, knight c6, and so on are all playable. In the game, Magnus does play the main line for black, and that is the move c5, heading for potentially a modern Bennett style structure if white ever goes d5, expanding in the center and closing the pawn structure. All right, now Alexandra, she does not go d5 yet. She also does not take on c5, heading for the endgame line with d takes, queen takes, rook takes, then bishop takes. White does win a pawn. However, computers do show black has tremendous compensation for the missing pawn, starting with the move knight d7. So Alexandra doesn't do that either. Instead, in the game, knight g to e2, maintaining the tension in the center, and this is the strongest move. Now here, Magnus, the main line for black is queen to a5, but instead knight c6 on the board, putting pressure on that pawn on d4. Now Alexandra, she continues, queen d2, very standard stuff, and so far she is doing an excellent job of managing her time. She's wasted only 12 seconds, and Magnus is down to 28 seconds left on the clock. All right, here, Magnus, again, queen to a5 is the standard idea. Instead, he just takes on d4, c takes d4, releasing the tension in the center. Very interesting choice by the world champion. Now, knight takes d4 on the board, and again, Magnus plays yet another curious-looking move, bishop d7. The idea of this move, potentially he wants to go knight takes d4 and then bishop c6, trying to put the bishop on this long diagonal. However, that would be a very strange move as the pawns on f3 and e4 are blocking that diagonal. However, beyond that, he is also setting up ideas like rook to c8, activating the rook on the open c file or the semi-open c file. Now here, Alexandra, she has the option in this position of actually going for a kingside attack with the moves either long castles or the immediate g4 or h4. This setup by black with knight c6, bishop d7, it is very slow. So for that reason, the all-out attacking idea would actually work here. But instead, she does go for a much more quiet idea, a bishop e2 followed by short castles, and she will have a small but very stable advantage in this position. All right, Magnus, knight takes d4 on the board, continuing with this idea of knight takes and then bishop c6, again putting the bishop on that long diagonal here. So, knight takes, then bishop c6 on the board, and now here Alexandra, once again, she has the option of long castles or g4 starting that kingside attack, but instead, short castles on the board. Again, she's playing for a very small but very stable advantage out of the opening. All right, Magnus Carlsen, where is his counterplay going to come from? He cannot sit back and wait, as white does have an advantage with that Maroczy bind structure in the center with his pawns on c4 and e4. Well, in the game, he does expand on the queen side, a5 on the board, potentially intending a4, gaining more space and clamping down on the queen side. Now Alexandra, she finds the best idea, b3, clamping down on that a4 advance from black. Now black technically can still go a4, however, it's not the strongest idea in this position. All right, Magnus, in this position, he reroutes the knight. Knight d7 on the board, a very good move, intending potentially knight d7 or knight to e5 here. And Alexandra, how does she want to proceed? Obviously, that bishop on g7 is exposed now, and Alexandra will have the option of either bishop takes g7 or something else. And what is the right move in this position? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and try to find the right idea for Alexandra Botez in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. All right, here, believe it or not, black is threatening to get into an endgame. Here, the threat from black is bishop takes d4, then queen takes, then queen to b6, and the queen on d4 would be pinned to the king on g1. That would get black into an endgame, and he actually has good chances in the endgame as opposed to the middle game. So Magnus Carlsen threatening to go to an endgame where he would have a very good position. Now Alexandra, what are her options to avoid that endgame? Well, one option is bishop takes g7, trading off those dark square bishops. Then after king takes, you can go king to h1, getting your king off this long diagonal here. not long diagonal, but the big diagonal. Instead of that, you can also go bishop f2 or bishop e3. The computer actually likes bishop e3 the most in this position. However, instead of that, here, Alexandra, she misses the idea. She goes rook a to b1, getting the rook off this long diagonal, avoiding weird tactics with the bishop. However, here, Magnus Carlsen, he goes for his idea. Bishop takes, and then queen b6 on the board. A very strong move. And now that queen on d4 is pinned to the king on g1. That means the queens are going to come off the board one way or another, whether Alexandra takes on b6 or Magnus takes on d4. Now, in the game, Alexandra does take on b6. Queen takes, then knight takes on the board. And now we do have that endgame that Magnus Carlsen wanted. And as you can see by the eval bar on the left, the game is much more equal. However, here again, Magnus Carlsen, he has just 25 seconds left on the clock versus the 4 minutes and 29 seconds of Alexandra. He's got his work cut out for him. He's got to win, and he's got to win fast. All right, here, Alexandra, a4, locking down the queen side. Now Magnus, rook f to c8, getting the rook to that semi-open c-file, trying to activate his pieces. All right, now Alexandra, knight d5, jumping in with the knight, putting pressure on that pawn on e7, and now knight takes e7 is a threat, forking both the king and the rook on c8. Of course, Magnus, he has to respond. In the game, he does trade off his bishop for the knight. Bishop takes d5, a very interesting idea. Here, Magnus, he wants that knight versus the bishop in the endgame. He wants that imbalance. So, bishop takes, then e takes for Alexandra, trying to keep that c-file closed, a good idea. And now she has the semi-open e-file. For example, she could go rook e1 in the future, putting pressure on that pawn on e7. That will be an advantage for her later in the game. All right, now, knight d7 on the board. Magnus rerouting the knight. Of course, on b6, that knight doing very, very little. He was entombed by these light-squared pawns on the queen side. But now the knight does have access to both c5 and e5, especially the c5 square. That will put pressure on that pawn on b3 in the future. Now here, Alexandra, f4, gaining space on the king side. Actually a very good move. Controlling e5, stopping knight to e5 ideas, and giving the bishop access to these diagonals here. And now, bishop g4, believe it or not, may be a threat, potentially trying to trade off her light-squared bishop for the knight on d7. However, Magnus Carlsen, he's on top of things. Knight c5 on the board, jumping in with the knight immediately and putting that pressure on that pawn on b3. Now rook b to e1, ideas will not work, as the knight will win the pawn immediately. All right, Alexandra, she continues playing excellently so far in this game. Bishop g4 on the board, putting pressure on the rook on c8. Now the rook has to move. In the game, rook c7, a decent idea by Magnus. And now rook f to e1, putting pressure on the pawn on e7. Alexandra, again, playing excellent so far in this game. All right, Magnus, rook to a6 is the move. An interesting idea. He is intending rook b6, putting pressure on the pawn on b3 with the a rook. Now, Alexandra, how will she defend? In the game, rook to e3, a good prophylactic move, defending the pawn on b3 in advance. However, after rook to b6, here Magnus, he has quite a bit of pressure on that pawn on b3. Both the rook and the knight are pressuring it. And here the two white rooks on b1 and e3 are both forced to defend passively. So Alexandra, what should she be doing here in this position? Well, it turns out the best idea is simply bishop d1, defending the pawn on b3 with the bishop. Then you can go, say, rook b2 to e2, putting more pressure on the pawn on e7. That would be the best placement of the pieces. But instead here, she goes for the immediate rook b to e1. She is in an aggressive mood. She wants that pawn on e7. However, she gives it the pawn on b3 if Magnus wants it. And as you can see by the eval bar collapsing on the left, here Magnus Carlsen, he has a big tactical shot. And it is the simple move. Rook takes b3 here. However, in the game, he doesn't go for it. Remember, he has 22 seconds left on the clock. He has to make split-second decisions here. And in the game, he does go king to f8, defending the pawn on e7, but this is a big mistake. And here, Alexandra, she gets in the move, bishop d1, defending the pawn on b3 with the bishop, and now she has perfect piece coordination. The bishop defending, the rooks attacking on the e-file, and here Magnus, what is his plan going to be? In the game, he finds a very creative solution. Rook to b4. His idea here, believe it or not, is going to be b5, the nuclear pawn advance, blowing open the queen side. Thereafter b5. If a takes, then a4 will be the move, simply removing the defender of that pawn on c4, and white's queen side will collapse. So that is the idea here. And of course, if b5, then c takes b5, then the c file does open up. The rook will have access to that pawn on f4, and again, black will have counterplay. All right, here, Alexandra, she gains space on the queen side with the move g4, a decent idea, but here Magnus, he plays his move, b5 on the queen side, a very powerful move. Now here, Alexandra, she does not take with the c-pawn. Again, that would be met by rook takes f4. Black would have a lot of activity. Instead, a takes b4 on the board, perhaps the better move, but here Magnus, he continues a4 on the board, a brilliant idea, removing the defender of that pawn on c4. Now, after a takes, black will be able to take either pawn on a4 or c4, and he will have lots of counterplay on the queen side. Now here, Alexandra, the move is b takes a4, and here Magnus, you have to find the right recapture. Which pawn do you take, and which piece do you take it with? Well, it turns out here the right move is knight takes a4, then the knight does guard that b6 square, stopping b6 ideas. Instead, in the game, Magnus does take on c4, rook takes c4, and this is a very big mistake. Here, Alexandra, she immediately spots the idea, b6, gaining space on the queen side, pressuring that pawn on c7, or the rook on c7, sorry. And now Magnus, he has 19 seconds left on the clock to find all the right moves. In the game, rook to b7. But again, Alexandra, she finds all the right moves here. a5, advancing on the queen side and supporting the pawn on b6. Now, obviously, rook takes b6 is not a possibility. Now here, Magnus, he takes that pawn on f4, that being the other idea of that b5, a4 idea. Rook takes f4 on the board. Magnus is getting activity in the center and on the king side. Now here, Alexandra, what should she be doing? Well, the computer loves the idea of h4, intending h5, maybe even h6, clamping down on the king side. Beyond that, you can also just go h3. That would be a more human-looking move, defending the pawn on g4 and freeing up the bishop on d1 to go elsewhere. Instead, in the game, she goes bishop e2, and this turns out to be a very critical mistake. Here in the game, Magnus, he spots the flaw with this move. The bishop no longer guards that a4 square, and here Magnus, rook to a4 is the move, ganging up on that pawn on a5. And again, you can see the eval bar collapsing here. Magnus Carlsen, he got his big break, but he's got 16 seconds left on the clock to convert to a victory. All right, bishop b5, harassing the rook. Then rook takes a5, then bishop c6, harassing the other rook. But now Magnus, he gobbles up the other pawn on the queen side. Rook takes b6, and suddenly Alexandra, she's down 2 pawns, those being the pawns on the e file and the f file. Her entire queen side has collapsed, and the b5 idea from Magnus earlier in the game has worked to perfection. All right, here, Alexandra, rook takes e7 is the move, winning back one of those pawns. But here, Magnus, rook to a2, activating the rook on the second rank. Now the threat could be rook b2, doubling up the rooks, then rook takes h2, and so on. All right, here, Alexandra, rook 1 to e2, trying to guard against that threat. Now we have rook takes, and rook to b4, pressuring the pawn on g4. How is Alexandra going to defend? In the game, h3, but then the knight jumps in. Knight to e4, the knight joining the party. Now king g2, king g7, rook to e3, and here Magnus. The right idea is going to be rook to b2, pushing back the king and potentially forcing it to the first rank on king g1, king f1, and so on. Instead here, Magnus, he plays a much more aggressive idea. f5, gaining space on the king side. However, this move is a little bit weak. Here, Alexandra, she has the opportunity to go g takes, then rook to f3, putting pressure on that very weak isolated pawn on the f5 square. Instead, king to f3 is the move, but this turns out to be a big mistake. Here, Magnus, he just jumps in with the king to f6, and now his knight on e4 is being defended by that pawn on f5. That means the rook on b4 is free to move. It is free to go elsewhere and harass the king, perhaps rook b2, rook f2, and so on. Now here in the game, g takes f5, but then knight to g5 for Magnus Carlsen, once again harassing the king, once again forcing it back. In the game, king g3, then g takes f5, and here the best move for Alexandra here to fight on is going to be rook to e8, activating the rook on the last rank from where it could harass the black king with, say, rook to f8 and so on. Instead, in the game, rook to a3. This turns out to be a little bit weaker, and here Magnus, he increases the pressure with just 11 seconds left on the clock. f4 hits the king to f2, then rook to b2, trying to force the king back. And here, the pawn and the knight control all of these squares on the third rank. Therefore, the king is forced back to the first rank. King to e1 on the board, but now king e5. Magnus, he's marching in with all of his pieces, the king, the pawn, the knight, the rook, and so on. Now Alexandra, h4 hits the knight, but then knight to e4. Magnus jumps in closer. rook d3, rook h2 harasses the pawn on h4. Now we have rook to f3, and finally rook takes h4. Magnus is now up 2 pawns, those 2 passed pawns on the king side. How is Alexandra going to defend? All right, rook f1 on the board, a very passive move. Now rook to h2. The king is once again entombed on the e1 square. Now we have king d1, then h5, expanding on the king side. Bishop d7, h4, bishop g4, and h3. The alpha 0 h-pawn on the king side advancing down the board. Now bishop f3, trying to control the h1 square and potentially threatening bishop takes e4 in the future. But now Magnus, rook to f2, putting pressure on the bishop and forcing off the trade of the rook. If the rook moves, then rook takes f3 does win the bishop. And if you take the knight, then rook takes f1 wins the rook. Therefore, rook takes f2 is forced here. We have rook takes, knight takes, king to e2. The king was under check. Knight to e4 retreats the knight. Now we have king d3 and knight to g3. Now that knight does control the h1 square, h2 and then h1 is a very real threat in this position. Again, how is Alexandra Botez going to defend? Well, Magnus has just 4 seconds left on the clock to make the rest of his moves. There is no time increment. If he can't make everything in 4 seconds, he will lose the game. All right, king d2, h2, king to e1, h1 promotes to a queen. Now bishop takes is forced. Bishop takes, knight takes, and now Magnus is up a knight and a pawn. But here Magnus has just 3 seconds left on the clock. All right, king to f1, then king takes d5. Magnus winning yet another pawn. King g2 harasses the knight, not king to e4 for Magnus. Now here Alexandra, she has just a king. She has no more chances of winning the game. However, she still has drawing chances. Again, Magnus has just 3 seconds left on the clock. All right, king takes h1, d5, king g1, d4, king f2, d3. Magnus advancing the pawn. Alexandra tries to defend, king to e1 on the board, but those 2 pawns are too much. King to e3 on the board, king d1, then f3. One of those pawns is going to promote to a queen. All right, king c1, f2, king b2, f1, promoting to a queen. King to c3, queen to e2. Now Magnus Carlsen, his plan is simple. d2, d1, then sliding the queens over the board, trying to deliver the checkmate. But he's got 2 seconds left on the clock. King to c4, d2, king to c5, d1, promotes to a queen. King b4, queen to c2, then queen b1, and finally the finishing move, queen to a2. With 1 second left on the clock, Magnus Carlsen delivers the checkmate against Alexandra Botez. Wow, what a game by both players here, Magnus and Alexandra. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen literally destroys Alexandra Botez in just 10 seconds. That game was incredible. I'm sure you're going to love it, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.